In another episode of Marine Ecology and Coral Reef Conservation, I am joined by David Obura, one of the world's leading marine ecologists. He is the founding director of CORDIO East Africa, a knowledge organization working towards supporting the sustainability of coral reefs and marine ecosystems in the Western Indian Ocean. Tune in to learn more about their work. Welcome, David, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
What got you interested in conservation and, in particular, marine ecology?
Oh, well, I've always been interested in conservation since growing up. Here in Kenya, we went camping a lot as a child, and I was always into wildlife in the national parks and hiking. So I grew up doing that. And then we were always also, Kenya has a coastline, so we were always coming to the beach during the school holidays and I was snorkeling on the reefs. So I think I always knew I would be a wildlife biologist of some sort, but it was only at university that I really confirmed that it would become marine ecology once I got into graduate school.
Why are marine ecosystems so important for the global economy and society as a whole?
Well, marine ecosystems are so important because they cover 70% of the planet, of the surface, but also the living space is so much larger because the ocean is deep and you have life in 3 dimensions. And, the physics and chemistry of the ocean determine our climate and our weather, the gases we breathe, ocean, oxygen, and of course the carbon dioxide that we emit. So, without the ocean, there'd be no life. So it's really important to understand the limits of the ocean. We don't see them very easily from land, and people think the ocean is limitless, and so we can't impact it. But now our global economy is just so large, and we consume so much that not only are we really impacting all of the land surface, we're impacting all of the ocean surface and the depths as well. So, and if we don't pull back from that, if we don't maintain a balance, then not only economy will suffer, but also society, our welfare will be undermined. So we really need to work on that.
What exactly is the blue economy and how can it contribute to ocean health and marine conservation?
Well, blue economy is a new term, but it's a bit of a catchy phrase, but it really means any economy that comes from the sea. And so now we label that as blue economy. But of course, that economy has been there since the beginning of time with seafarers and trading across oceans and even in coastal zones, fishermen going out fishing from canoes and things like that and sailing boats. Now we call it the blue economy, but also trying to get a sense of sustainability, so complementary to the green economy on land, trying to make sure that the ocean economy is fundamentally sustainable and also inclusive so that, all people or the right people can have access to benefits from the ocean. So we always try and put the word sustainable and inclusive in front of the word blue economy because there are many sectors are just jumping on the word. And if you go out fishing from the ocean in the same way as before, it's basically not a sustainable blue economy, but just, extracting wealth from the sea. The same with shipping and mining and construction and other things like that. So we're really trying to make sure that ocean health is fully front and center in discussions on blue economy to make sure we're not undermining it, and that conservation and sustainability are really the focus of management to make sure that all our uses are sustainable.
One important component of the blue economy are fisheries. So talk about your keynote lecture at the World Fisheries Congress.
So fisheries is perhaps the best known of the blue economy sectors and certainly delivers a lot of benefits to people in terms of income, but also livelihoods to small scale fishers. I I like. It's very rough, but there's quite a nice statistic that points out that I think 80% of the income, 80% of the cash value or the total value of marine fisheries goes to the commercial and the large scale fishing boats that, traverse the oceans and have, you have to be very wealthy to own one of those. And that fish gets traded in economies around the world. So that's 80% of the total value. But 80% of the people involved in fisheries are in small scale fisheries. And so they only earn 20% of that total value. And that's from their small boats and so on. So what I was trying to present in my talk at the World Fisheries Congress is just to make sure that this issue of equity, of the rights of small scale users, is always front and center when we're talking about sustainability now and global planning, because many times it's the large corporate owners that have large budgets for research and for PR and marketing. Their messaging tends to dominate the space around fisheries, just as it does in other sectors. And we forget how important fisheries and ecosystem health is for small scale users. So at the Fisheries Congress, I thought I'd be a little bit, on shaky ground, because I was anticipating there being, a lot of fisheries modelers and so on and corporate interests. But in fact, the fisheries research community is very much looking at equity in small scale fisheries now all over the world, the rights of tribes and indigenous peoples in terms of ownership of fishery rights where they live. The Congress was in Seattle, in Washington State in the US there, and there the local indigenous tribes have had treaties with the federal government to own 50% of the fisheries and so on. So it's really front and center what we're talking about now all over the world. So that's what my presentation was on, and there was real fertile ground for it. We had a lot of discussions and a lot of sessions where we're discussing the same issues.
So what impact does fisheries have on marine biodiversity, and how can they be made more sustainable to support marine conservation?
Well, fisheries directly extract fish or other species as well, not just fish, but also invertebrates and, and sharks and things like that. So if you extract too much, of course, you deplete the populations of that species, and that can have huge impacts on their population biology and their ecology and the interactions that they have with other species in the ecosystem. So if you take out all the top predators, then the herbivores or the trophic levels below them are not being killed, so they can overpopulate and then they can deplete the layer below them. So fisheries can really distort the trophic interactions and the food webs in the sea if you take out too much. So the key thing for sustainability is making sure that we're not over extracting. And in the past, fisheries have tended to be focused on this metric or indicator called maximum sustainable yield. It's an economic indicator, sort of combined with looking at the population size or the number of individuals or biomass of that fish species. So it's a very narrow measure of what is considered sustainable. Now we look much more at the interactions of a species with the others around them in the ecosystem. So it might be, and in many cases, it's likely that to not impact on the, say, a coral reef ecosystem, the fishery should be harvesting or catching fish at less than the maximum sustainable yield, according to its definition. So there's a lot of work that's happening right now to try and understand that. And of course, it's very complex and very difficult to get it just right.
So how can SDGs be incorporated to sustain a healthy ocean economy?
Now, you've touched on one of my favorite topics there, because I think about the SDGs a lot. And partly that's because I was frustrated, I guess, about 5 years ago with how I felt there's a very shallow understanding of the SDGs. And people were thinking they're just for national governments and the United Nations systems to consider. of course, quite simplified words, so they were treated very simply. And then in the governance processes, they identified a lot of indicators that are very much top national level indicators around policies and some, things that are very intangible on the ground. But really what the SDGs are is it was the countries developed them through many years of discussion. And I think the SDGs, they basically are a narrative or a story about what sustainable living is on the ground. So if you think about them in a local context, so I've been doing that in a coral reef village, for example. If you think about, sorry, my dog is going to bark every now and then. So if you think about SDG 14 on ocean health, that's about the health of the coral reef that supports the economy of the area. And it supports the economy and jobs in the area. That's SDG 8. And from those jobs, fishermen or fisher people and their families get income. That's SDG 1, and they get food. That's SDG 2. So you can really understand, the local economy in the context of the SDGs. So if you think about the SDGs, you can express the life in a local area in a way that's very tangible to local people. And in fact, they can express their lives through the SDGs as well. You don't have to use the words that are used in the goals themselves. So in that sense, I think the SDGs are perfect for planning a healthy ocean economy, because you can really, the whole point with the ocean economy is looking at all of the different sectors that impact on the ocean, the different stakeholder groups, how sustainable their actions are, how equitably benefits or wealth is shared amongst people. So I've done some work in local contexts where you get stakeholders to look at the SDGs and try and think about the space between. How do they interact together across all of the SDGs rather than thinking just about their own one? And I think that's very useful in thinking about a healthy ocean economy.
In 2019, you authored a paper about coral reef monitoring and reef assessment technologies. Can you elaborate on how exactly do you monitor a coral reef and how technology is enabling coral reef conservation at a global scale?
Okay, well, so my organization and many others, of course, we invest a lot in monitoring our ecosystem to understand its health. And that's the famous saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I don't think that's entirely true, but it helps a lot to have the data and indicators. So we've invested a lot in coral reef monitoring around the world, and coral reefs are a very coherent ecosystem. So that paper was really about synthesizing or summarizing sort of the global standard in coral reef monitoring at that time. So what we do is it's a very observational process, which, especially 40 to 50 years ago, when people could start going in the water very easily, scuba diving, and a beautiful ecosystem. So, of course, all coral reef scientists want to go in and dive around a reef and get paid to do that. So we go down and we count the fish. We look at the proportion of the bottom that is covered by different types of coral and algae. So it's very much, very locally driven, very, very place-based monitoring. Now technologies are really revolutionizing that in great ways, because, of course, we can collect a lot more data, but also means we don't have to go in the water so much as scientists, which is a bit of a shame. But we've started using digital cameras a lot to collect still photos or video, just pointing down at the reef, and then later on you can look at the photos or the video to estimate the percent cover. Now it can be done using artificial intelligence, so that you don't need, observer time doing that part of it. Then there's many different multi-sensor approaches that are being trialed, where you can, look at different, parts of the light spectrum to measure that more quantitatively, either in the water and drones, or in the air in planes or drones, and then, of course, from satellites as well. So there's a huge revolution in technology now for monitoring. There's also things like monitoring sound. A lot of animals in the water make different sounds. So fish, shrimp, copepods, and plankton, a coral reef is a very noisy place. So you can monitor the soundscape And you can really hear as reefs degrade and the number of species go down and their interactions go down, they become a lot quieter and the sounds change. So you can do sound-based monitoring. There's environmental DNA as well. eDNA is very promising for the ocean because we can see so little of the ocean when we go down because of the visibility is not nearly as good as in the air. And it's hard to work physically in the ocean to get through it over large spaces. So the DNA carried in the water that leaches out of all the species is a fantastic way of monitoring what species are there. So there's all sorts of new technologies coming. And I think, every 5 years, there'll be ones we never imagined people will discover and we'll be able to use them for monitoring.
Much of your research has focused on coral reef resilience. What exactly do you mean by resilience in this case, and why is it important for coral reef conservation?
Yeah, thanks. So I've done a lot of my coral reef work has been looking at coral reef resilience. I think it's a really useful concept, ecological, and now we say socio-ecological resilience. The principles are very similar in most systems, living and inanimate systems as well. Resilience is a really important concept because what it addresses is the ability of a system to stay in the same state, or if it's perturbed, say by, being pushed, the pendulum is pushed from the bottom position, it comes back to the same place. So that shows a certain type of resilience. And you can look at much more complicated types of resilience in living and social systems. And scientists will argue a lot about the specifics of how you define resilience and how you measure it. But it's a very intuitive concept. And I think people really understand it. Basically, it's that capacity to stay in the same state when being perturbed. Now, that's really important for coral reefs now and for many ecosystems because a lot of human pressures and direct uses, the perturbations, we're taking out too many individuals of species that we harvest, we're clearing too much land and, too much coral reef. And at what point do they go past a state that they can't recover themselves? So in the case of fishing on a reef, if there are too many fishermen, the fish populations can't recover, they decline more and more and more, and then that may trigger another system, let's say the interaction between algae and corals on the reef, because they compete with each other, and fish eat the algae. So if the fish decimated, algae can take over, and then corals can't grow, and then it may pass a point where if you stop the fishing, the reef may not be able to recover back to its normal state of more fish, less algae, and more coral. So resilience is very useful. We're looking at it for climate change as well with coral bleaching, which is the whitening of corals because of high temperatures and then their mortality after that. If there's too much mortality of corals, then there's no corals in the vicinity or nearby to repopulate impacted reefs with larvae and young corals that come in the water. So then the overall system will decline. So it's a very important concept for coral reef conservation. And now that, it's long been said that 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is the point at which coral reefs may not be able to recover and, repopulate themselves, particularly with ongoing threats on the ground. And now we're actually reaching that threshold in the next few years. We'll really see. I think this is really a testing time for reefs to understand what we need to do to enable them to recover, to enable their resilience to be rebuilt. So it's dangerous times for coral reefs in that respect.
So you are the founding director of CORDIO East Africa. What exactly was the idea behind this organization, and what is your long-term vision here?
Well, I founded CORDIO East Africa because I was really looking for sort of the right kind of platform for my career here in East Africa. I'm Kenyan, and I did most of my schooling in Kenya, but I went to North America for the end of high school and for university. But then when I was doing my PhD in the US, I I decided to do my PhD research in Kenya because I always wanted to come back. So that way I could make sure I was studying something that I could come back with afterwards. And then when I came back to Kenya, I worked in other contexts for 2 years, a couple of years that were not so satisfying. And so I was looking around for how I could build up the right platform for my career to be, a reasonable amount of flexibility, to look at the regional scale at coral reefs rather than just in Kenya and so on. And so this was I came back in 1997. And then in 1998, we had the first global coral bleaching event. And in 1998 was the Super El Nino. It was the hottest year on record. And so we lost a lot of corals in East Africa and other parts of the world too. But the information from East Africa was not very coherent. There was only small amounts. So then a colleague of mine, a Swedish scientist, saw the chance to raise some money for a regional project. And he asked me to join. And so I became the coordinator for East Africa, and we had a couple of other sub-regional coordinators in South Asia and in the islands in the Western Indian Ocean. And after a few years, I set up CORDIO as a non-profit organization because I realized this was a great opportunity to have an independent research organization focused on this topic, looking at the regional scale, and then working very closely with communities and small-scale fishers on the ground, but also with marine parks in the various countries we were working with to support their management, and working with other scientists in Kenya and in other countries as collaborators, so we could help bring in some funding, and then we could work with partners on the ground to do coherent research and monitoring of coral reefs, and then report it all together and raise awareness of the state of reefs at the regional level. And then, of course, I hoped that setting it up in Kenya, it could also be a platform for other Kenyans or East Africans also looking for a platform for their careers, so they could, that they could come and join us and start their careers in marine science.
So CORDIO works extensively in LMMAs. So what exactly are LMMAs, and what are some key challenges faced in the conservation of these areas?
Yes, we have death by acronym in a lot of fields. So so LMMAs is the term we use for locally managed marine areas. And the idea there is that, the governments in our region have limited resources for managing many ecosystems and locations in their countries, and also along the coastal zones. So there is really a gap in management and in protection for coral reefs and mangroves and seagrasses, and for managing fisheries in particular as well. And over time, the government realized that the scale of the challenge, and because fishing communities already had local authorities, local village elders in the fishing community, and then the younger fishermen working with them, they had what we now call beach management units. So the government recognized those sort of indigenous or local entities as the main sort of locus for managing fisheries on the ground. And so we have been working with these communities anyway over the years. So we then thought this was a great idea to do this, not just in Kenya, in Tanzania, Mozambique, Madagascar. There are similar ideas around the same, just with different names. And so we've really focused a lot on building capacity in fishing communities to undertake these responsibilities that they have, helping with the monitoring. So, we've developed monitoring approaches and techniques that are much more appropriate for fishing communities. Remember, fishermen know what the fish look like, and they're fish accountants by trade, but they use their names, they use different names from place to place. They don't necessarily count in the same way that we would. So we try to do a bridging of skill sets of what fishers already have, and then what we need to support sort of science-based monitoring and decision making. So the locally managed marine areas are a way to now get the beach management units to engage around realizing that it's good to protect a part of the reefs, a part of the sea, in order to maintain the fish stocks for their security in the future. So if you fish everywhere and you don't do it very carefully, you can really undermine the fish populations. But if you reserve an area that is unfished, then you make sure that you retain, especially large fish, because large fish produce a lot more eggs than small fish. And it also protects the ecosystem in that area. So we're really investing a lot in LMMAs throughout the region as really the next solution for marine conservation throughout the West Indian Ocean region. In many countries, because of the history with national parks, and they have been very top-down in the past, not now. I mean, it varies a lot from place to place in the character of those on site. But because they're very top-down and controlled by the government, many communities are very suspicious or fearful of losing control and losing access to their resources. So locally managed marine areas are a way to help ensure they have some rights and empowerment and agency in decision-making, and so they can preserve their interests in the area while conserving the reefs at the same time.
Talk about give a brief overview on CORDIO's report on the legislative guidelines for LMMAs in Kenya.
Yes, so our legislative guidance on LMMAs. So I'm not an expert on this area. When I started my fieldwork, an early career when CORDIO started, I did a lot of fieldwork just doing mapping and monitoring with communities. But of course, as that work built up, it's not my expertise. So my co-director took it over. And over time, what we did with this report, for example, is so if you're trying to set up LMMAs, what's the legal basis for them? Do the communities have legal rights to stop other people from fishing in an area or to stop some of their own residents? Can they set fish size limits and so on? So that if somebody does infringe on those limits or the bylaws that they set, if you take them to court, in the past, there's no basis for a judge to support the fishing communities. So the legislative guidelines are really to help the government machinery identify what the legislative basis should be to help support this management of marine systems by communities. So it's a very long and consultative process, and of course it involves many, many partners as well. And this was an early effort that we contributed in this, along with others, to sort of try and move the agenda on laws that really support co-management of marine systems.
How can individuals contribute to CORDIO?
Well, that's we're a very typical research organization in that we're very focused on our research, and we essentially, get a lot of people coming through as knowledge holders in CORDIO. So our staff, of course, are our main asset, and then we get interns and students and collaborators coming through. At the moment, we actually haven't really set up any sort of mechanism for individual contributions or support from people, because there hasn't been a huge culture of that in East Africa yet on the sea. But we gain a lot from people talking about our work as well and promoting it in different areas. Particularly, we're a knowledge organization, so we put out reports and we help knowledge become better known, knowledge from the fishing communities as well. So others using that in their processes, so working in another area on fisheries or conservation as well, is very good. Scientists, of course, we cite each other's work. So that sort of mention of our work is good. But we'll have to work out a way to get more individual contributions from people in different ways. If people have marketing and, graphic design and other skills like that, sometimes we do collaborations to put out products and things, which can be very exciting.
That's nice. So what have been some of the most prominent challenges and lessons from the conservation career?
Oh, well, there's a lot of challenges in conservation. Keeping a funding stream coming, of course, is the biggest one. But we've been able to do that so far for 25 years, so that's great. And now myself and my co-director are, we're coming to the later years in our careers where we are making space now for the next generation. to come in and have leadership roles in the organization. So continuity and getting the right people and keeping them, I think, is the hardest thing. In science, there's always very strong competition around publishing and ideas, which provides challenges. And of course, conservation successes are very hard to demonstrate. That's one of the hardest things doing this kind of work. I've been working in coral reefs for 25 or 30 years now, and coral reefs are in much worse state now in 2024 than they were in 1995 when I was finishing my PhD. And that's because of global warming, and it's because of, population growth and growth in economic extraction, which is much faster. So it's very hard to show positive result for our work. But of course, we know that if we weren't doing this, things could be a lot worse than they are now. I think in memorable moments, I think some of the most memorable moments was when I was just after my PhD and working with communities here on the coast, going out on their canoes with them in the rain and in the waves and with a GPS to mark their sites and record the names of their sites. I mean, I learned a lot from them and how different people, they have different perspectives. We all see different things in the environment. Some of it is individual, some of it is cultural, but really understanding that you have to have a dialogue with people to meet halfway, rather than scientists like myself, trying to push our ideas and our findings too heavily onto people when they have their own knowledge as well, their own experience. And we need to discover that or bring it out as well and to blend our work with theirs. There's been a lot of great moments, both challenging and really memorable as well.
So that was the final question I had for you for this podcast. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure is mine.
If you made it till the end of this podcast, feel free to leave your thoughts on the topic and do not forget to share and subscribe. Before we end the podcast, I would like to share another list of conservation books which I highly recommend. This time it is on the topic of rewilding and ecological restoration. The first is a seminal book called Rewilding: The Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery by Glenn Blight and Paul Chipson, which covers the restoration of ecological processes and ecosystem functioning by the reintroduction of species, especially megaherbivores. A less technical and science-heavy book is Rewilding Africa: The Restoration of Wilderness on a War-Ravaged Continent, which explores conservation across various heavily militarized landscapes. And the final book is Wilder: How Rewilding is Transforming Conservation and Changing the World. This covers the rewilding of various charismatic species ranging from pumas in the US to the Arabian oryx in the Middle East and giant tortoise. And with that, I would like to end this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. See you next Monday.